Welcome to Make Your Money Matter with Brad Barrett, the show that aims to change the way you think about wealth management. Brad is a financial advisor, established radio host, and author of Retire Right. He is a managing director and partner at One Capital Management, an SEC-registered investment advisory firm managing over $4 billion for clients across the nation. Brad and his team are dedicated to helping clients protect and preserve their assets so they can reach their investment and retirement goals. And now, your host of Make Your Money Matter, Brad Barrett.
Welcome in to Make Your Money Matter. I'm your host, Brad Barrett. I'm also managing director and partner here at One Capital Management. Today on our show, we're going to talk about how presidential elections affect the stock market. Friends, I've said this often. For many of you who listen here each and every week, you've heard me say this, but the relationship between politics and the stock market is not a simple and obvious one. And we're going to go through some questions today that many of you are likely thinking. And we're also going to talk about some things on the platform that we might be seeing here in the next month or two, being that we're sitting here in mid-June. We're going to talk about some relationships with platform and parties. It's completely bipartisan, down the middle. A lot of it's going to be anecdotal and experience-based, as well as some data for you. Just good things to think about as you're thinking about what or who you're going to vote for this coming election, but also how that relates to your investments and your overall retirement. But before we get started, make sure to go to our website at onecapital.com. You can click on the media tab and you can download and subscribe to our podcast. You can also download our podcast on Spotify or SoundCloud or the Apple iTunes app on your phone. And do us a favor, leave us a review, give us a message. It always helps us share our weekly podcast with more people. And with that, let's get started. So, how do presidential elections affect the stock market? Now, obviously the stage is set for November. Okay, we're sitting here mid-June, so we're a little premature, but I'm saying this because I think, and I'm in history over the past 4 elections that I've been involved with as an advisor, we're gonna start to get hot and heavy here in the next month or two. So, some investors, right, might be concerned about, the impact on politics and stock markets. And, I think ever since really, to be honest with you, the 2016 presidential election, it kind of resulted in large market swings, if you recall. And the political climate, it's really, I would say, even more polarized today. So really, I'm going to state a couple questions here that we're going to help answer throughout the process here. Like, how should you as an investor react to what may or may not be, let's say, a bitter campaign? Should investors like us, should we fear either party winning in the White House? And is it best to sit on the sidelines until the dust settles? We're going to attack those questions because here's the reason why. And again, this is bipartisan. This is straight down the middle. All I want to do is provide experience with some anecdotal evidence and some data. But as citizens, myself included, as taxpayers, as voters, elections are extremely important. All right, let's not let the craziness that has happened over the past really 2 or 3 elections deter us from a very proud part of our freedom. And this is true regardless of which side of the aisle you're on and which candidate you support. Your vote, our vote, helps to determine the principles that will be upheld by the country in years to come. Whether you agree with that or not, that is still a fact in our free economy. However, it is obviously important, I think, with that said, to separate the personal and political feelings from financial plans and investments. When it comes down to it, long-term investors, which is who I'm speaking to, especially as our clients here at One Capital Management, we should be wary at all times, all right, of claims that, one candidate or another will, quote unquote, kill the market or ruin the economy, all right? And it's likely this has been said about every president, in really modern times over the past 14 presidencies, really since 1933. There's been 7, by the way, from each party since then. Let me give you an example. This was certainly said about both Presidents Trump and Obama in our recent history. In 2016, markets, if you recall, plummeted overnight when candidate Trump became President-elect Trump, only to then, as we all know, reach all-time highs by the end of that year and rally until the COVID-19 crisis. Now, during the 2012 midterm elections, going back even further, political pundits focused on the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and how it would burden the economy. And an investor, by the way, who bought on election day in 2012, just going back, and held until election day 2016, would have experienced a 63% total return, or roughly 16% average annual return. Don't lose the forest for the trees is what I'm trying to share. Now, throughout these examples, these are just two of many, right? Investors who overreacted to politics rather than underlying economic facts and data would have missed out on significant portfolio growth. That is point number one for today's show. Now, to be clear, this doesn't guarantee, and I want to be very clear about this, this doesn't guarantee that either candidate has a sound economic plan, or it doesn't suggest that their policy proposals and values don't matter. They definitely do. Because government policy can certainly have an impact on things like economic growth. For example, through corporate taxes and trade, and can also affect things like specific stocks, bonds, and other sectors and industries through, let's call it the sandbox of regulations that they allow us to play in. However, for most long-term investors, it makes more sense to focus on economic and market fundamentals. I know that sounds boring, rather than day-to-day election coverage. I'm going to bring in some sports for a second. Now, I don't know if many of you are watching the NBA finals. I'm personally a hockey guy, so I'm more into the Stanley Cup finals. But I want to bring up good old tried and true Mr. Boring Tim Duncan. I remember as a kid, obviously growing up a Lakers fan, but seeing him go back and forth, not just with the Celtics, which was a great rivalry from the 80s, but also with the Spurs and how dominant they were. And Tim Duncan was at the center of that. And if you think about it, they called him Mr. Fundamental. He was off the backboard. He was just your boring, in an investor world, long money manager, but it worked. It won them championship after championship. Think about that as you're watching the NBA finals even, and looking at what you are thinking about when it comes to an election this year in 2024, and also as it relates to your investments. Being the Tim Duncan of your investments is not a bad thing. It's not flashy, I'm aware, but it works. And I think it's important. And I said this at the onset of our show today. This is all because, again, the relationship between politics and the stock market is not a simple and obvious one. There might be things like conventional wisdom about how each political party may affect the economy. And these views have actually, if you look at it, really a poor record when it comes to predicting stock market returns. Not only is economic policy difficult to evaluate, I can speak this from studying economics, okay? Economic policy is very hard to evaluate, but implementing and enforcing the policies takes time. And even when investor predictions are correct, the market tends to price in these facts well ahead of time. So if you're reading something or subscribing to these news blogs or whatever, I've seen them, I've heard about them from clients and friends, just be wary because you're probably already past the mark. It's crazy to me sometimes to think that we don't feel like a CEO of a large bank, for example, hasn't already thought about some of the things that you're subscribing to and reading, and has not already maybe implemented that into his sector, into his company, and throughout his regions that he's operating in. Let me give you an example. One reason for a significant surge in the stock market after the 2016 election was a recovery from the corporate earnings recession we saw in 2015 and 2016. And Trump was, hell-bent on that platform for a reason. And similarly, one reason the market outperformed so well after 2008 and 2012 and other election years was that it bounced back from the global financial crisis, Eurozone crisis at the time, and all these other problems along the way. So, I'm bringing those up simply to say it's not a stretch to argue that these, we'll call them macro trends, kind of the higher level trends, would have driven markets irrespective of which party controlled the White House. Something to think about.
Stay connected. Get frequent updates on the show. Follow Brad Barrett and Make Your Money Matter on most social media platforms. And catch full episodes of Make Your Money Matter streaming now on our YouTube channel. To schedule your no-obligation appointment, go to onecapital.com or call 805-410-5454.
Now, I've bored you enough on thoughts and theories and commentary from past elections and in recent history. So I know you're probably thinking about Brad, okay, great. But what does a U.S. presidential election year look like from the markets? Okay, I'm going to bring up a stat here for you. Morningstar actually did, I think, a really great stat recently on the S&P 500, and they took it from January 1st, 1926, okay, 1926, nearly 100 years ago, to December 31st of 23, so 6 months ago, all right? On average, in the first quarter of the year, of an election year, so for example, the first quarter of this year, on average, it's returned a positive 1.3. Second quarter was a positive 1.5. Now get this, third and fourth quarter on average over that nearly 100 years and during presidential election years, the third quarter averaged a positive 6.2% and the fourth quarter a 3.3%. By no means, all right, does past performance in these averages reflect or guarantee any indicator of future results or returns. But it's interesting to see that. Now, I'm sure we can find certain years within the election year where they were down that's lowering that average, and we can, get really myopic on those point of views. But I thought it was a really good overview, a macro view of nearly the past 100 years of presidential years. Basically, the first half of presidential election years tends to be sluggish. Now, I'm going to stop there for a second. We're here in June. We've just gone through 2 quarters. We're kind of seeing that play out. Again, I am not suggesting that the third and fourth quarter are going to be what they have been on the average, but it is interesting to note, and I actually mentioned this study in January, February on this podcast, and now 6 months later, I'm bringing it back up because it's still relevant, and we've gone through the first and second quarter, and they've kind of played out to pretty much what these trends are. Again, not suggesting it's going to be third and fourth quarter, but something to consider. Now, I want to switch gears for a second because I want to focus on something as it relates to what I think we're going to start seeing, and we've already somewhat started seeing, the rhetoric and the narrative about inequality. And look, again, this is bipartisan. This is more from the heart and bringing up something. I want to put some data to this as we think about it, because it's been a reoccurring theme, and we think it's all new, but it's not. It's been a reoccurring theme pretty much every presidential election starting in 1932, if not even before that. And I'm bringing this up because in college, as an economics degree, I also had a political science minor, and I kind of got nerdy about that for many, many years there. And I think it's really interesting to kind of take time periods and what we're dealing with in those time periods and relate them to things that we're thinking of now. So this is not a new theme by any means. So one question, we kind of tend to ask, and I want to give the benefit of the doubt, they're trying to address on these platforms and these debates, is what should the federal government do itself to address poverty or expand opportunities for the poor and close the gap, the quote unquote gap between the rich and the poor. It's obviously a potent political talking point. I'm not trying to stir up anybody. I want to bring this up here for a second because large parts of government spending, along with many agencies and programs, are designed to address it. We see it. We're paying for that as taxpayers, which is why I'm bringing it up. Inflation, immigration, record high corporate profits, soaring stock markets are all in the spotlight as well. Now, Biden proposes student loan debt forgiveness and caps on drug prices. That's kind of what he's rolling out with right now. And Donald Trump has basically said he will end the taxation of tip income for service workers. Those are kind of the two things that are coming up to light here, and you're going to see that talk more about. And these policies are focused on relieving financial burdens on specific groups, which is why I'm highlighting those two key points on their platform. Now, more importantly, I think if we look at results of policies during the pandemic, right? And remember, we had massive monetary and fiscal stimulus during those time periods, but it's clear that those who own assets benefited, while those who did not were harmed. Hint, hint, you own assets right now. If you're invested in the stock market, you're owning assets. And even if you didn't own them then or now, but you're accumulating them, like stocks, bonds, real estate, you have benefited or likely will benefit from asset price inflation, particularly those whose jobs allowed them to work remotely. That's a whole thing that we've been studying over the past couple years. And obviously inflation is at the forefront of all this, right? Because, it's a given that those with fewer financial assets benefited less from price appreciation. We can all see that. You don't have to be on either side of the aisle or know data to see that. And no matter how we look at it, living standards have at best stagnated for those with few assets and wage income. So I understand the focus here. And politicians have pushed for an increase in the minimum wage, right? Well, that's a big topic right now, to try to help lower income workers keep pace with inflation. But look, and I'm only saying this from an economic perspective, I have a doubt that that's actually helping. Let me give you an example. Here in California, where most of us live, myself included, there was a recent law that raised the minimum wage from restaurant workers to $20 an hour versus $16 an hour for other workers. Now, at the same time, overall unemployment remains low at 4%, which is up only about 0.3 percentage points from a year ago. But that overall modest increase masks some large increases among younger workers. Think about this, all right? This is some data, and it's a little heavy, but try to follow along here, okay? And just meditate on this. Unemployment among 16 to 17-year-olds. I don't know about you, but I got my first job when I was 16. As soon as I got my truck that I paid for, $3,000, 1994 Ford Ranger, I'll never forget it, right? I had a job. And many of you listening probably did too. So unemployment among 16 to 17-year-olds has soared to 13.6% from 9.7% just a year ago. Unemployment from 20 to 24-year-olds has risen to 7.9% versus 6.3% just a year ago. Basically, the kids are increasingly not all right in the current labor market. And no matter how much time politicians spend talking about inequality, I think too small a share of it would be spent discussing the horrible long-term effects of the lockdowns. Let's just call a spade a spade. Now, one way, it's an opinion, but a lot of economic data support it. One way to address educational inequality is for states to continue to move in the direction of funding students rather than funding government-run schools. Because most state governments fund schools and not students. Those who could afford private schools avoided a good deal of the learning loss that we saw during the pandemic when there was a big loss aversion there for those that weren't working or being educated. Now, meanwhile, in the background of all this is the issue of huge number of low-skilled workers coming across the border in the past few years. Obviously, people come to the U.S. will be able to earn more likely than their home countries. But whether or not this immigration is overall good or bad for the U.S. economy, low-skilled immigration almost certainly benefits higher-income natives who don't have to compete in the labor market against newcomers, much more so than low-income Americans who often do have to compete. That's the focus. And the fact that all these problems became worse during the pandemic is, look, it's just ironic, right? Many politicians believe that the real source of inequality is capitalism itself. That is false, in my opinion. With America, as this poster child of capitalism, but in the US, during lockdowns, government, including the Fed, became bigger and more powerful than ever while living standards stagnated for those who had not accumulated assets. The real and only proven way, and so I'm bringing this up, and I didn't mean to bore you there, but it was kind of on my heart. Been doing some reading. The real and only proven way to create less inequality is to allow free market capitalism to do its thing, to let it work. Interfering in that process, i.e. government intervention, creates more problems than it solves. As we saw with the pandemic, the cure was worse than the disease. Now, I know that can hit home with some people, and I'm not saying that this wasn't affected by any people, but what we did as a whole was a large overreaction. I think a lot of us looking back can agree to. No doubt it was scary at the time. No doubt it affected many, many people, and myself included. But I'm just going to go out and say this and say that when we interfere with these processes, it has to come to roost. And what I want to share to bring it all home is we want to make sure we don't overreact in a year like this with everything I mentioned in the top of the show, even to some of the spotlighting of things on these platforms, debates you're going to start hearing, right? Let's not overreact and overthink it. Find counsel, talk it through, make sure it works for you, and make sure what you're letting in is actually what you believe. As I've said often, it's a really good statement to make, right? Remember that it's not the water around a boat that sinks the ship, it's the water that gets in. Right now, we're letting a lot of things in, whether through social media, whatever media outlet we're watching, right? We're getting subliminally messaged to, and just make sure you have someone to talk that out with. Because whatever decision you're making with your money in particular, or even with your vote, right, has a lot to do with your perceptions of the world, of our economy, of our society, of our country, everything. So make sure you have good counsel to talk it through. Find that advisor to speak through it. And remember, everything I'm saying today was meant out of love and was meant straight down the middle. I was trying to bring facts and evidence to it. And yes, there's some opinions involved in that. And I want to share that openly and just say that I think it's really important that we have a platform to talk about. It's one of the best things about our country is we can agree to disagree, okay? And it's okay to have that. And I think that's a really great notion as we go into November, heading into an election year, on who we are looking at to be the commander-in-chief, the leader of the free world. And keeping in mind that whatever happens in DC doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen in the stock market. They do have interplay with each other, but remember, the relationships between politics and the stock market isn't as simple and obvious, and it's important to dissect that with a good financial advisor. Hey, I want to thank you for listening to our show today. And as always, before acting on anything discussed, speak with a financial advisor near you about your specific situation. Or again, if you'd like our help, you can reach us at 805-410-5454 or on our website at onecapital.com. And until next week, always remember to make your money matter.
The information in this show is educational and general in nature and does not take into consideration a listener's personal circumstances. Therefore, it is not intended to be a substitute for specific individualized financial, legal, or tax advice. To determine which strategies or investments may be suitable for you, consult the appropriate qualified professional prior to making a final decision.